as people are looking through their book, what are some of the things you want to make sure that they pull out?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I'm really proud of in the book is there's actually a quiz about moderation. And the quiz is kind of called like, are you able to moderate or not? And it's based off of just my professional experience with who is a good candidate for it. And I think it's really helpful with explaining kind of, you may be able to moderate, but you may not.
Yeah.
And there are some things where someone could moderate, but there's a big space where I'm kind of like, you might be able to moderate, but you might spend a lot of time fighting that moderation through
Yeah.
staying in that moderation point of view. And I think a lot of people unfortunately stay there and kind of stay miserable because, like we've talked about, they don't ever have that full, it's kind of, when we talk about it, and I talked about it a lot in my first book, of just, how your brain works is a lot of times, especially with a substance like alcohol that shuts down that decision-making part of your brain, that rational part of your brain, it's really hard to kind of be dipping in and out of a substance that impacts your brain in that way. And it can cause a lot of suffering, I think, for people. And, I think it's so interesting where it could actually be easier and people would have a better life, which sounds so different if they were sober, because moderation can be so hard.
Yeah. And it's exhausting. That was my
Yes.
experience. It was just exhausting. And I kept failing at it. And yet it was what I wanted more than anything in the world. And one of the things you teach, and I know in your first book, but also in this workbook, is how do you regulate your emotions without alcohol? Because I know I drank when I wanted my happiness to be even higher, when I was bored and I just wanted time to flow more quickly, and angry, lonely, all the things, resentful, frustrated, insecure, you name it.
Yeah. That's a big part of the book. There's a whole chapter on emotional regulation, and I created like an acronym that helps people, because one of the biggest questions that I get asked often is, how do I process my emotions? How do I deal with them? I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like. So I created an acronym. It's called NAILER, and it walks you through step by step of exactly how to process your emotions. And there's a worksheet in the workbook called How to Process an Emotion, which walks you through exactly what to do, which I think it's really helpful to just kind of have that structure. So, like the first part of how to process an emotion is noticing how your body feels. Often before we even have words to describe what's happening or what emotion is happening, our body has a physical response. Our heart rate increases, our palms sweat. We may feel like, our throat is closing up, we're sweating. So the first step is really just noticing how that, is physically happening. And often this is the point too, where we may be tempted to like grab a drink before we even recognize that we're having an emotion. And it's interesting. A lot of clients I work with, right, they'll say, I don't even know what happened. I just all of a sudden was drinking. I don't even remember thinking about it.
Yeah.
And what happens sometimes is we condition ourselves to drink in response to these different physiological sensations that are happening in our body.
Yeah. And so you notice it, and then there's a bunch of other steps to process it without turning to alcohol.
Yes. So once we notice, we then can like acknowledge that we're having, a sensation going on. Then we can get curious. The I is like investigate, get curious about the context of our life. What's interesting is sometimes you can have, right, your heart rate increasing, and it could not be related to an emotion necessarily. It could be like you just went for a brisk walk and you misinterpret what your heart rate is doing, right? So it's noticing the context of what's going on in your life. And with that context, then you can move on to the next step and you can label the emotion. And there's such cool, interesting research about the power of actually knowing the exact right word for the emotion that you're feeling. And it's really interesting if you think about kids, and when they're really young, they often only have a couple words to describe how they're feeling. You know, they may have mad, sad, and happy. And when we only have a few words, it actually really shapes our experience. So kids often are one of those three because that's the language that they have.
Yeah.
So I have worksheets and examples also on just like, I have a huge like emotion or a huge emotion bank of words that people can learn about and understand. And it's cool to also, I have examples of other emotions in different languages, because it shows you kind of how you can think of that experience and you understand how someone could have that emotion, but maybe you never had the word for it. Like there is a German word that I'm going to butcher how I say it. It's called Schadenfreude or something like that.
Is it Schadenfreude or no?
Yes, there you go. There you go. Right. And it's like
I studied
happiness
German in high school and did an exchange in Germany for a winter semester. So I was like, wait a minute.
Oh my God, perfect. Right. So that word means it's like the joy of someone else like failing or suffering.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And it's like a word that you can, once you understand that, you're like, I've probably felt that way before at some point. So that's really helpful in those worksheets of learning how to understand.
Pleasure derived from someone else's misfortune. Yep.
Yes. There you go.
I felt that. And it's like, but you would think that in American words, that would be like guilt, but not really, you know
exactly.
what I mean? Like, it's almost like, yeah, I'm an asshole. Like that's
right. But it doesn't, there isn't any word that we have that quite fits that exact phrase. So researchers have kind of proven that the more emotion words you learn, the more specifically you can understand how you feel, and the better then you can regulate your emotions, right? Because if we can identify, I'm not going to say the word again, that, right, the joy of watching someone be miserable, you're going to treat that differently than just guilt that you have, right?
Yeah.
So that's what's so interesting. So the L in Naylor is labeling, and then the ER is like explore and release. And that's where we kind of get back into our body, think of coping skills that we can do, explore if this is a common pattern that happens to us often. Do we often feel this way? You know, if you're noticing you feel a lot of guilt, there may be some things that you want to work on or change in your life. And once you kind of explore, sometimes it's really helpful to just actually release that emotion, whether that's physically through going for a walk, through listening to music, through getting into your body in some capacity is really, really helpful for kind of getting out of your head and working through that physiological tension that's come up. So I have different examples of kind of how to work through each step. And then you can kind of get into the process of repeating it so that you just kind of do it automatically.